Hello everyone, it's Luke here from 3D Tutor. Today we're back with another complete guide. This one is a bit of a special one as it is one of the first 3D Tutor environmental videos with characters in it. And it has to be one of my favorite ones in regards to its unique atmosphere and visual storytelling. Within the scene we've put a lot of effort and thought into making it look authentic and unique. Before we move on though, if you're interested in how long this scene took and what are our thoughts on how difficult it was in regards to putting it all together, then stay till the end where we will give you a complete breakdown of how long each one of the sections took and what skill level you might need in order to pull it off. The scene comes with its own packed blend files as well as Unreal Engine project, both complete with all textures and models as you see here, so you can download these assets and try them out yourself. And recently, we've just started putting our work onto Sketchfab, meaning that you can preview our work in a browser from basically any device with internet access. Links to everything are down below, and while you're there, give us a like and hit the subscribe button. The packs are great if you want to see how exactly the scene was put together, to help you in any Blender or Unreal Engine projects you may be working on now or in the future. These packs or courses are available via our Gumroad along with all the YouTube complete guides. Also, anyone that signs up to our Patreon basically gets everything on our Gumroad for the price of a cup of coffee, so be sure to check the Patreon link as well. If you want your idea to be featured though in one of our complete guides, then drop a comment down below as we'd really love to get some inspiration from you. Finally, all of the techniques you see here are covered in our massive library of over 20 courses with over 200,000 downloads, so be sure to check those out as well. We have just uploaded a brand new course focusing on teaching all there is to know about Unreal Engine 5. The course will help you master environmental building techniques, working with landscapes and various assets, and we will even create our own fully functional water VFX system from scratch using material shaders and Niagara particles. So if you're interested in learning Unreal Engine 5, I really recommend you checking out the course. And now on with the show. What you're here for is the guide, so let's get started on our Blender to Unreal Engine 5 Monster Hot Spring environment. Hello and welcome to the modeling part of the video. Now in order to get this started, since Neil, the main guy that does modeling, was away for the project, I had all the creative freedom in the world to create whatever I wanted. And so I decided to create a nice and cozy environment with some characters inside. We over at 3D Tutor are often focused on building environments, so we don't often get a chance to work on the type of creatures, so it definitely was quite a challenge for me. But anyway, to get started, I started off by just building and blocking out the entire environment and setting out all the necessary type of a gray box within the scene. I wanted to make sure we see both sides, the inside and outside, so I decided to leave out a wall on the side. This way we'd be able to see what's going on inside as well as just having the outside kind of a camera. And then afterwards I wanted to get the main shapes out of the way, so things that will allow us to break off the entire type of a scenery, things like walls and furniture like benches for example. All of them will help us to break away the entire silhouette of the environment, so as making sure we're getting the placement for them right. Then afterwards I wanted to make sure we are getting a nice type of a hot spring within the front section of our camera. We had to make sure that we're breaking off the entire shape for the scene, since we wanted to make it look a little bit more organic and not just kind of a squarish. So I used the knife tool just to go all the way around, and then afterwards I played around with a little bit of the framing of like the roof and whatnot. I wanted to make sure it looks good from a top-down kind of a view as well for things like turntables or when we're presenting the work. But I wasn't quite sure if it would look right with kind of a roof at the very top, if it was too much, and if you wanted to see the inside from the higher aerial type of shots. So again, since I was just blocking it out at the very start, I wanted to get a nicer kind of a feel. And yeah, I didn't quite like the roof, but I did leave off a roof at the very front, since otherwise the front section would have looked quite flat, the one that has the door entrance to the hot spring for our area. And yeah, although it's not going to be visible from the main shot, just by having a nice composition throughout the entire scene just helps out to get a nicer environment type for our scene. And once I was happy with blocking out the entire environment, I decided to get myself a different plane as well from the water itself and just get a border around the hot spring area, and I was playing around by just simply getting a nice simple border just as a breaking point for the entire scene. But I wasn't quite sure if that's going to look quite as nice, so I think later on I just switched that up with simple wooden planks, and I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to play around with the entrance areas within the scene. So I was figuring out whether I'd want some doors or maybe like some curtains, and I think I stayed with the curtains because it just gave off so many different shapes to work with, and also we were able to just have the curtain hanging on the side so we'd be able to see what's going on through the door. So yeah, once I was happy with the kind of a basic shape for the curtains, I went back to the entire section within the hot springs for the rocks, and I wanted to figure out how I'm going to keep the layout. So I just placed a couple of rocks randomly at the moment and just had them kind of work as a placeholders in order to break off the entire edge at the front of our hot spring where it ends. And afterwards I played around with the way the lanterns were going to hang with the light sources, internal light sources and external ones. And of course I was using a bunch of references when working on this project. Wanted to get a nice type of a look within the scene. So yeah, using pure ref is just really good for that. You can just like overlay your entire board of images, and then you're able to just control it within the screen, and just it allows you to quickly just go between references, and I quite like that. And then I figured that I need to do a couple of props within the scene, a couple of smaller props, so things like buckets and whatnot, just to break off the entire shape and add a bit of extra complexity within the scene. And I wanted to figure out how I'm going to do the internal area as well, since I felt like it was a little bit too much closed off. We do have a wall and the roof missing, but the other side felt like a little bit more of a clustered up space, especially with all the cupboards blocked out in the area. I didn't want to move the blocked out cupboards, but I did want to add something to that wall, so I decided to add a quick window within an area, and I think that worked quite alright. I was playing around with the layout, how I'm going to have it, if I'm going to have it partially opened or completely closed, and which side it would be opening from. And once I was happy with the layout, I just decided to start doing the modeling, the actual detail modeling that we needed for the scene. So I started off by getting the entrance right, and I wanted to make sure we have some like steps within the area. And once I was happy with that, we had to get the framework out for the housing as well, just to make sure we don't have just completely plain walls, and that structure of the entire area is a little bit more sound, and it wouldn't look like it would just be blown away by a simple gust of wind. And yeah, after that I kind of wanted to think about extra smaller props. Actually, I wanted to add a little bit of an extra touch, and I was thinking about what kind of things you'd find in sauna in order to break away all the simple looking design within an area. Of course, I didn't want to overcomplicate this entire section. I wanted to keep the simplicity a little bit, and just to make sure that the overall design is looking quite nice. And so I added things like towels. I added a couple of variations of them, and within the inside I realized that there's no proper interior lighting. I was thinking about using the type of lanterns that I had outside, but it didn't quite look as right. I wanted to have like for starters, I wanted to have them be a little bit more smaller, and I wanted to light up the interior in a different kind of a lighting as well. So if we were to use the same type of light and we were lighting it in a different kind of way, it wouldn't look quite as right. So in order to change up the lighting, I just did a quick different mesh for the area, and that seemed to have worked out quite alright. And then afterwards I went in and broken off the edges of the fence as well, just to make sure that we're having it look a bit nicer. I was trying to figure out if we want them to look thin or thick, or if we just not need the fence at all. But yeah, I ended up by just getting it some variation within the fence, just to break off the entire silhouette within the background of our main shot. And I didn't want it to look too broken off, so I just had this sort of a flow, which turned out quite alright. I quite liked the way the fence ended up to be. I think in the end I did add a couple of bevels just to soften up the edges and not make it quite as harsh. But other than that, just by making a couple of variations within the mesh using squares, or cubes for that matter, within a 3D space, I was able to get a really nice and simplistic type of fence. And by working at the front, I wanted to add a couple of variations within the framework. I wanted to make sure that we have it nicely broken apart within the section and that it works quite alright. I still wasn't quite sure if it'll look quite alright if we were just to hide the entire frontal section of the framework with just a single kind of a wooden beam. So I think in the end I did raise it up a little bit, had a bit of a gap underneath the frontal section where the housing begins. In order to continue working on small props, I decided to start off with the buckets within the area and actually properly model it out first. So in order for me to do that, I just got myself a nice cylinder and made sure that the shape goes outwards on the top. Then afterwards I made use out of the topology, out of the polygons. The faces themselves are broken them apart and just kind of extended them in their thickness and just made them look like planks. Then as for the bottom section of the bucket, I just made sure I do pretty much the same kind of a way, except for the breaking up part. I just wanted to make sure we have more of a gap within, since when we were doing it we had the planks going outwards from a circular kind of a motion, but for the planar types on the bottom we didn't have that, so we had to manually kind of scale them in on themselves and make the gap in between those planks just so we could have more of a point for where the planks break off in between. And then afterwards I wanted to get a bit of an extra variation out of the bucket itself, so I was playing around with the shape and I was trying to maybe get like a handle or something of the sort just to make the overall design look a bit nicer. But I realized that at the very start when I created it, it was a little bit too thin, so I ended up just extending it by quite a bit actually, just to make sure that it goes with the stylized type of a style. And of course, in order to make sure that the bucket is kind of secure, I added a couple of rings that are going to be metal in the future, which by the way also helps to kind of cover up the silhouette of the roundish shape of a bucket. So I think it just works quite nice. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I got those two variations placed on top of one another and then placed it at the very front sections within a hot spring. I think I placed them later on inside as well, just to get additional kind of meshes within the area. But yeah, going back to the hot spring, I didn't like the overall border that we had, so I just went in and started playing around with the planks and was thinking on how I'm going to make use out of them in order to cover up this entire shape. At first I was thinking out to just do it manually, just to get some nicer shapes within an area and just to make the overall hot spring look a little bit more stylized, but I didn't quite like the overall design, the way it turned out, so I ended up scratching the idea, just deleting all of them and tried using the formations instead. So what I did first is I created myself a long line of wooden borders and then just made use out of them with a deformation. I think I made use out of lettuce, so I quickly created myself a box around those entire planks and then just used the deformer in order to shape up our entire planks. So that was quite nice. I quite like this kind of a way of working, but of course using a deformer on those kind of rounded edges was a bit hard, so maybe I should have used a different type of deformer for that, but it ended up working all right. I just added more resolution to the lettuce deformer and that seemed to have helped me out quite a bit. And again, just going back to the shape, trying to figure out how I'd like the overall design to be for those planks and if I want them to be looking more stylized, more deformed and whatnot. And yeah, just working around with those kind of shapes, I was able to get some real nice border that breaks off the edge for the where the water is going to be and the ground level. And I was trying to think if it doesn't look quite alright within the area and if the planks have too smooth of a shape when they're sticking up together, so I've broken them off a little bit as well. And speaking of breaking off edges, I realized that the walls themselves aren't looking quite as nice within the front section, so I was thinking about the design of the walls themselves within an area, and I realized that it might look quite alright if we'd have those kind of paper thin walls that you'd see within hot springs, and I quite liked the overall design, but I didn't want to make use out of them throughout the entire section. So I think some of the walls I kept them as a kind of a concrete type of walls, and other walls are just going to be basically made out of thinner material with a lot of framework in between. So I quite liked the overall design for that, and so I ended up sticking with it. And of course the window section for where the window is going to go, I quite liked it as well, for it to have that thin type of a look. So I ended up just using that same design that I had set up previously, and I quite liked the overall look. I just had to make sure that all of them are being placed properly within an area, and yeah, once I was happy with that, I just ended up beveling off the edges, just making sure that it looks alright. I think I forgot to reset all the transformations by clicking Ctrl and A actually, so the beveling didn't work quite as well. I did come back to it later on in the future though, just to reset all the transformations, and that seemed to have fixed an issue. But yeah, anyways, moving on, in order to just get the right kind of a look, the right kind of a style, I wanted to make sure that the lamps, the lanterns, are properly set up. They have a nice kind of a silhouette, and since they're going to have light sources, they're going to be quite visible. So we got to make sure that they're not just kind of simple squares, and they do have a certain silhouette within them. And so I added up the kind of a border framework for the lanterns, and just quickly adding a bit of a thickness to them as well, and just kind of playing around with the overall shape, trying to think if we need to like bevel off the edges, round them off or whatnot, but keeping it as a square kind of a design, I think it worked out quite well. I was considering about just using kind of torches, lanterns and whatnot, more traditional type of light sources, but just having some lamps inside, I think that worked quite alright, since we're also having some concrete type of wall. So we're just basically going to have like a semi-modern type of an art style within this area, and I think it overall works out quite alright. So moving on, I wanted to make sure we get ourselves a nice type of a roof for the front, for the entrance of our environment, since it'll make it look quite nice, although it's not going to be seen with the main shot. Again, it's just going to add that extra touch for whenever the camera is rotating, for whenever we're going to see the other side, and just it'll make it look, the entire environment, and make it look a bit more complete. And so I just quickly created myself a type of a pattern. I added the roof plates, and then just worked with the entire mesh, and just deleted the couple of them on the side, just making sure that we get the right kind of a size and scale. And in order to make sure that it doesn't overlap, doesn't go beyond the walls, and don't end up clipping through the other mesh, I did make use out of a bisect tool just to cut off all the mesh or where it's sticking to the wall. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I kind of wanted to add additional kind of an extra decoration touch for the side of the roof as well. So I did make use out of a different mesh and just set up a type of a cylinder on the side. It didn't look quite as nice as just a simple cylinder. I was thinking about maybe just using like a wood type, but it wouldn't quite look right on the top of the roof. So I did ended up breaking off the entire shape for the sides of the roof by just getting a couple of extra edge loops and just using an extrusion mode for that. And once I was happy with that, I was thinking about how each of the beams, how each of the framework within our environment is going to kind of combine, connect with one another, and we're able to use them in order to break off the silhouette. But not only that, we have to consider when working with them how they're actually going to interact with one another, and if it's going to make the entire structure look better or worse. And I think I went with something in the middle. I think I just got a couple of beams to be sticking out a little bit more than they should, just since the certain walls looked a little bit too plain. So I made use out of that technique, and then afterwards I wanted to get the overall roof within the area, within the entrance, to look a little bit better. So I did make use out of the lattice deformation again. Quite like using that deformer. It does help you get a different type of a silhouette throughout the entire shape of a cluster of meshes. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I just played around a little bit with the side and got myself a nice type of shape. And make sure that frontal area has nicer supports as well. I added a couple of wooden beams to it and just made sure that the bottom, the foundation for those beams, are broken off a little bit, just to make sure that we get a bit of a nicer shape for the area. And yeah, just going back and forth between the walls and the frontal section of the roof, making sure that overall layout is looking quite nice, playing around a little bit with an additional kind of frames within an area and just making sure that it has a nice kind of a support for the house, as well as we're able to make use out of it in order to break off the walls. And once I was happy with the overall entrance, I then moved on to trying to get better shapes out of our shelves within an area, and I just got myself a really quick and simple section, and that's able to give us a real nice type of result. And then I duplicated it on the other side and just kind of played around with the overall silhouette a little bit more, just to get a different type of a variation. And once I was happy with that, I played around a little bit more with the other shelves as well. The one in the middle, I wanted to make it look a little bit more interesting instead of just having some empty holes within it. So I was trying to figure out how I'm going to approach this, and I ended up just making them look like they're sort of locker boxes within an area. So I wanted to have a couple of them to just be closed off and some of them to be opened up. And so the way I did it was basically I got all of those areas, or where I wanted the holes to be a little bit more opened up, and this way I just basically stretched them back to the middle section of the furniture to get some holes, and I created a couple of doors, and that way we're able to make them look like they're open and get some more nicer shapes out of the furniture. And of course, as for the handles, I wanted to make them look a little bit nicer, a little bit better for the middle. So I was playing around with how they're going to look like, and I figured that I'm going to use a boolean tool just to cut out a couple of shapes for where the handle is going to be placed inside. And so what I did was I basically got two meshes, one for the framework of a handle and a second one as a way to make use out of it in order to get ourselves a way to bevel out the areas for those locker doors. And yeah, for us to do that, I just made a duplicate out of the entire pattern and just basically combined all of those beveled meshes and just made use out of them to get those holes inside. And once I got that, I got all of those doors that had holes within them and just was able to open them up a little bit in order to break away the pattern. I just kind of quickly randomly made sure that the angle is at a nice position, and I did that manually so we'd have a bit more of a custom look to them. And yeah, going back, I was still trying to figure out how we're going to have the framework, so I slightly tweaked the overall design and just made it look a little bit nicer overall. I think in order to get a nicer type of a base, I added an extra foundation for the framework as well, and that just gave us a bit of an extra look. And going forward, I wanted to get some nicer benches within an area since the overall kind of a blocky look didn't quite fit as well. So I made sure to get some planks to be overlaid on top of those benches and make use out of them. But of course, we couldn't just overcomplicate it, so keeping it simplistic was the way to go. So I didn't add too much detail to it, just a basic amount, and that made it look quite alright. And then moving on with the overall design, I was playing around with the area, playing with the kind of a layout of the section, and I realized that I didn't have the towels set up just yet. So I was trying to figure out what I'm going to do with them, the way I'm going to set them up, and how exactly I'm going to put them within the section. And then I just got myself a basic kind of a knife tool and cut out the overall shape of the folds of the towel myself, just to make them have more control over the area and just to make sure I don't overcomplicate it basically. And then afterwards I just got the framework, I just extended it and just used Solidify in order to get a thick mesh out of this entire section. And then I just played around a little bit with the bevels, wanted to make sure we have some soft looking type of a mesh within an area, but not too overly complicated. So just adding a bit of a bevel to the towels, I think it worked out quite alright. and then going to another variation, making another variation out of the towel. I just made a simple type of a look as well. I wanted to make one look like it's folded sideways, so I actually just grabbed the vertices that we had, just rotated them around the way that I wanted them, and it turned out quite alright. I still wasn't quite sure if it looked quite as nice as I'd like them to be, but I think all in all it made it look quite alright for the overall design of the scene, as they were quite stylized in regards to the way they were shaped. So yeah, just made sure that they fit within the environment, and we're able to kind of fold them sideways on the bucket just to get a nice type of a shape from within the scene. And then afterwards I just played around. I think I used to actually lettuce deformer again in order to make it look like it is being covered up at the side of that bucket. So simply by playing around with the shape, by just making it look like it's nicely placed. Looking back at it though, I might have just used maybe like a cloth simulation or something of the sort in order to just place it nicely and easily. That would have been faster maybe, but just going back and forth, just placing a couple of shapes within an environment, it wasn't too difficult to set up. And yeah, once I was happy with the overall shape for the towels, I just went on placing them inside as well, just making sure we break off some of those empty shells and make them look like they have something inside. So just duplicating a couple of those towels, I was able to get some nice shapes out of them and get some nice results in the end. And once I was happy with that, of course we had to work with our lantern as well. We currently just have it set up as a simple type of a capsule, just it doesn't look quite as well, so I wanted to make sure we set them up right. And I used a sort of a reference for the light sources, so we'd get a nice type of a result. We couldn't just overcomplicate it though, because we are keeping it as a simplistic type of a shape. So I just wanted to make sure we have a type of an overall design from them to look quite as nice. And I knew that I'm going to have some additional details placed within them using Substance Painter, using the texturing process later on to have some height and normal information for the framework. So I wasn't too worried about the overall surface detail for them. I just wanted to get the overall shape for the mesh itself to look quite a bit nicer. So I played around with the hook and got myself a real nice metal type of a hook, which I think I also made sure that in order to break it apart, I add a bit of an extra touch to them. So yeah, just playing around with the vertices, getting the right type of a shape was quite nice. I think I didn't quite like the way it was being attached to the wall, so I added an additional type of an attachment to the overall shape of that lantern. So I ended up replacing it real quick in the end, but all in all it did look quite alright. I did get myself couple of beveled off edges, and actually if you notice, we don't have any of the characters within the scene yet, and the reason being is that I don't actually know if I'd be able to pull this off at the moment, because I haven't done the characters in such a long time, or even the ones that I made were like really basic. So since I'm not quite specialized in that area, I was a bit worried that it might not turn out alright. So I figured that, you know what, if I don't get nice looking characters, I'm just going to cut it out from the video and just have this environment as is. And so I worked with everything until the very end, and then I added the characters by the very last second of this design, just to make sure that we're getting it look the right type of kind of a look for the area, for the design. Yeah, moving on, we are currently making some curtains as well. We are just making sure we're using some of the curvature tools and just setting up a nice type of a zigzag pattern for them. And I was playing around with the shape, was just trying to manually kind of get the folds that I want and play around with the overall design in that regard. And I think I made it look quite alright. I didn't want to have it too much detail within this area. I just wanted to have a sort of a way to break off the silhouette for the entrance of the overall environment, so we'd have a nice kind of a camera to be looking over the side of that area. And I think all in all it turned out quite alright, to be honest. I quite like the design for that. And yeah, by going back, I wanted to get a simple hook to the side as well, so I ended up just getting another curvature and just applying to that. The default shape was quite alright, so I just made use out of that. And I think to adjust the shape, I just used a move tool with an average out vertices, and that just allowed me to move the vertices as a whole to just get the right type of a shape. So I basically got myself a nice kind of a hook to hold that side of a wire framework, and yeah, it turned out quite alright in regards to the door, since I was manually basically modeling out the entire section for the folds for the curtains. I was worried that it's not going to look quite alright, but all in all it did made it look quite nice. Of course, we had to make sure we have them looking nice hanging on the side as well, so I just manually kind of placed them in with certain hangers, with certain mesh for the hangers attached to the bar at the top, and it turned out quite alright. I did struggle a little bit by just trying to get them to be attached to the folded fabric look that we had, so I just kind of manually placed down the vertices and got nicer results by doing that. And of course, looking at the reference, I realized that there is actually 2 of those attachments coming at the very end of that area, just to, I guess, make it more stable and make sure that it doesn't get ripped off as easily, I suppose. So I added another one at the very end as well, so that turned out quite nice. Yeah, looking back at the overall design, I did end up enjoying this in the overall process. It did give us a really nice and simple way to create a hot spring. We just had to make sure we add some detail where it needs to be and just make sure that it's not overcomplicated, while at the same time that detail just complements the overall environment, and I think it turned out quite alright. I did make use out of the same type of a cloth mesh for the entrance of our hot spring as well, but I didn't quite like the overall fold that it had, so I ended up just deleting everything at the bottom and just making it look like it's being kind of casually placed downwards, and I think it turned out quite alright. And yeah, going back to the lanterns, I played around a little bit more with the shape, with the overall kind of a design, and I was quite happy with that. And then once I was done with the overall design, with everything, I went into ZBrush to sculpt out some rocks. So I just quickly grabbed the entire mesh actually, just to be able to work to the reference for the placement of them, and I actually made use out of those same meshes with a Sculptors Pro, I believe, just to make sure that I don't have to worry about the topology. Or actually, I think I just used a simple Dynamesh, since I'm more used to that kind of a workflow, and I don't have to worry about the scale of the brushes too much. So by simply Dynameshing it, we're able to get a nice density throughout the rocks, and I'm just using trim dynamics to get the nice kind of formation of those rocky areas. And of course, since they are stylized, we just had to focus on the overall silhouette of them and not the kind of a small micro detail from within. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I went on just getting myself the shape of the foundation or the hot spring as well. Wanted to make sure we have a certain ground type of a look from within. So what I did was I just got myself this entire mesh and just Dynameshed it, set myself up for the Dynamesh first though, and just used the trim dynamic again, just like I did on the rocks, to get a nicer type of a formation. I also had to make sure it looks quite nice in regards to how the framework is for the wood ends as well, so I just pulled them around a little bit to get a nicer shape overall. And once I was happy with that, we then went on to basically model out the characters for the scene. So the first one that I wanted to do was basically a small type of a character that's just chilling around within the sauna, within the hot spring that is, and just enjoying his type. I wanted to make it look a bit more cutesy and squishy, so I made sure that I use a type of a foundation for where he's going to sit and just kind of form its entire body to that kind of a sitting position. Then afterwards, I wanted to make it look somewhat of a cartoonish. I like the design for the ones that I found where a character is wearing a mask and they look quite nice, type of spirit looking monsters, and I enjoy the overall design, so I made a heavy inspiration from that, and I played around with the mask a little bit. I pulled it out just to get some crevices within it, some additional shape out of it, while still not overly making it overly complicated. And then afterwards I'll be just basically texturing out certain eye expressions to it. So I left it as is by just getting a simple mask on the face, and I wanted to get a bit of an extra like a detail with horns, so I made use out of the head in order to sculpt it out as well. It was a relatively easy process. I think I used sculptures for that, and with a snake hook you're able to get a really nice type of a form in any way that you want for the horns. So I made use out of that. Of course, for the head itself we have to make sure it deforms properly within that area, so by using dam standard around the horns we're able to make it look like they're forming up properly within that area. And at the same time I UV unwrapped the entire mesh just to make it easier, since the automatic UV unwrapper for ZBrush is quite useful for whenever you have organic shapes within your areas. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I actually wanted to create a bit of a larger, kind of a scary looking monster for the area as well. So my main kind of a reference that I got for it is actually from One Piece, the animation series from Japan. One of the longest running ones in history actually. Seemingly friendly looking doctor that you have within the crew by the name of Chopper. A little deer that is usually quite friendly, but whenever he gets angry he can turn himself into quite a bit of a monster, and I quite like the design for that monster, so I figured I'm going to make a bit of a reference or take some heavy inspiration from it and get myself that kind of a look. And of course I wanted to make it look like it's fitting within the environment itself, so I made sure I not overly complicated. I made it look like it's part of the same kind of environment and they're part of the same kind of creatures, but again this one is a bit more of a scarier one, so it still has horns like the previous one and it still has that kind of a chibi looking style, but I didn't want to make it look like it's overly cutesy, so I added some broad shoulders to him, and of course I added the same kind of a mask that the previous character would have, but this time I wanted to make it look like it's a bit of a damaged type of a mask, a bit more of a meaner type of a mask, so I made it look a bit more like a skull I suppose, and I made sure it has sharper bit of an angles. I played around with the eyes a little bit. I figured I might want to make them look like they're angry or whatnot, but I figured that at the end I just wanted to hide the overall emotion, the face of that character, and I just kept it as wide open, and then later on I'll add some red eyes or whatnot and just make it look nice. And to make the overall mask look like it's been through a lot for a certain battle or whatnot, I also added a bit of a crack, a bit of a damage as well. I also did the same thing for the horns as well, so I made sure that they're looking quite nice overall. I didn't want to overdo with the overall design, so I just tried to keep it as simple as possible actually. But I think I got carried away with this overall design, since we don't need it to be super detailed within this simplistic environment. But I did want to add some additional kind of a fur growing on its shoulders. I will add some textures of a furry type of a design later on, but just making sure that we have some additional depth from this character, I wanted to add some fur type of a clamps at the very top as well, just so it have a certain like chunky type of a feeling from this character as well. So I was trying to figure out how I'm going to apply this entire mesh, how I'm going to apply this type of an alpha. I happen to have a really nice fur alpha to use basically, so I made use out of that, but I was trying to figure out how I'm going to kind of overlay one with another, so I'm actually just making use out of a morph target, and that allows me to kind of store morph target for whenever I'm placing and for the character, and just making sure for whenever I'm placing another fur that's next to the side, they're not overlapping, so I'm using a morph brush to just bring back the previous type of a fur, and that way I'm able to kind of overlay them nicely with one another. And I'm adding just a couple of hooves for where the character is going to be standing. And then afterwards I figured I might as well add a bit of a weapon kind of to the character to just make it look extra nice within an area. And I was trying to figure out how I'm going to do it. I didn't want to overcomplicate it, so by having like some basic type of spikes coming out of it made it look quite nice. And of course, in order to make it look like they're sticking in, I just used a bit of a clay brush actually this time in order to brush out the detail for where the spikes are sticking in. We just had to make sure that we're using transparency with this type of a sculpting, so when we're sculpting on top of a battered place, they wouldn't be affected by the shape of a spike itself. And yeah, moving on, once I was happy with the overall design, I was trying to get a bit of a more optimized mesh. I just combined them all, I think I dynameshed it, or not dynameshed it, I just dynameshed the entire character a little bit, or I think zero meshed it at this point, because I wanted to make sure I still have the right type of topology to allow me to basically sculpt out the entire shape. And I made use out of a lasso masking and just got a really nice type of result. In order to make sure that the joints are not bending in an awkward kind of shape, I made sure to feather out the masking in between those areas for where the mask section is. And of course, in order to fold the entire section to make sure that the gizmo is placed in the right area, I was just using Alt and just grabbing the entire gizmo position and positioning it in the right way so we'd be able to rotate it in a nice kind of a pattern. And then afterwards, in order to make it look like it's a heavy type of a weapon, I made it look like it's being dragged across the floor. I think it turned out quite alright in regards to that. And I just got some fingers to go across it. I realized that the fingers aren't kind of reaching the bat itself in the right kind of way, so I ended up extending them just a little bit, but I don't think I did that for the other hand, so hopefully it doesn't look too out of the ordinary in that regard. But yeah, going back to it, I just made sure that it has a certain pose of it walking towards the other character, just dragging this massive club, maybe trying to do something mean to him. So it'll be kind of a nice juxtaposition between the characters, between the cuddly type and the mean type look within this entire scene. And I think it turned out quite alright. I don't like the overall design. I was actually initially thinking about just making it calm and easy to make type of scene with just a couple of chibi looking characters, and that would have been it. But in the end, I did end up just making a bit of a gruesome type of a look, I suppose, within this area. But it did end up looking quite alright. What I didn't realize was that I didn't actually think about the position of the character within the section. So I was playing around with how I'm going to place it, and there wasn't a lot of space in between the lockers. And especially with the club, I was trying to think if I should perhaps maybe rotate the club a little bit just to make it fit a little bit more. But I ended up just keeping the entire shape, entire figure of the character as is, and just positioning it within the right kind of way, especially in the right place where I'd be able to see the character from behind the frame of the door. So when I was actually working with the position, I had to make sure that I have that character visible from the front section as well. Maybe it doesn't quite become fully visible, but just having a type of a silhouette coming from behind that area turns out to look quite alright. So yeah, once I was happy with that, I just played around with the overall kind of a shape, tried to figure out how I'm going to keep it as is, and basically afterwards I just had to make sure I export everything out to Blender as well. I just made sure that all the rocks and whatnot are clustered up in the right kind of position, and just got myself everything combined into, I think, 4 pieces for where the rocky areas is. The first character and the second character would be in separate FBX meshes, and then finally the ground would also be in the right on its own kind of FBX. So then afterwards I just brought everything in basically and replaced the old assets that I used. And actually I did forget to add a sort of a base for the mesh for where the character is sitting, so I just quickly created a plane for that. I didn't have to overcomplicate it, so would have a nicer type of a look. And afterwards I just played around with the bevels a little bit, getting myself a right type of a shape. They weren't behaving at the very start the right kind of way, because I realized now that I just forgot to reset the transformations, and that gave me certain types of issues because they were stretched out in the wrong kind of a manner. But then afterwards, after I reset it all, it was working quite alright. So I was just making use out of them to get the right kind of results for the benches, for the areas, for the framework and whatnot, and just made sure that everything looked quite alright. So with all the cleanup work, I was just making sure that everything is going to add an additional kind of a extra stylized look within the scene. And I wasn't too worried about the overall optimization for the mesh. I just had to make sure we don't go too overly much in regards to that, and I can always just make use out of a remesh tool, and that helps us to even keep the UV coordinates if we want them to be, so it's quite easy and nice to make use out of. But of course we just had to make sure we get everything set up in the right kind of way. And I've actually forgot to add benches at the inside as well, so I quickly added them up, made sure I make certain adjustments, stretch them in a little bit on themselves, and when I was modifying the length of them, I just used the base selection for them and just kind of extended them out that way, so we wouldn't be changing the foundation for the legs too much in regards to deforming them. And then I actually turned on the cavity tool, the cavity view tool, to just visualize how the edges are going to look like when they're highlighted, and that gave me a better understanding on how the overall design for the environment is going to turn out to be. And then I wanted to play around with how the characters are going to be sitting on the water, how the little guy is going to be placed, so I wanted to make sure that it sits nicely within the hot spring water itself and is able to chill there quite nicely. And yeah, once I was happy with everything, basically with all the beveled edges, with the design and the water levels, I then went in and started by applying all the materials in different sections. I wanted to make sure that we don't overuse the entire materials, since all the material combinations are going to be using the same mesh for when we're texturing. So I just made use out of something like 4 or 5 material sets and just applied it to different kind of props within the section based on their size and whatnot. And I just had to make sure that those props are actually of the same manner. So for example, all the towels would be placed in one and all the lanterns will be placed in the other, and that way we're able to texture them out easily in the future with that type of a workflow. And just to make it easier to see, to visualize everything, how they're combined, how the materials combine, made sure to color them as well in different types of colors, so we'd be able to just get nicer results out of them. And I'd be able to see which ones need applying different material and which ones should be kept in the same category and whatnot. And yeah, when we're doing this kind of work, we gotta think of the texture density that we're going to be using in the future. And since I knew that we're going to use 4K resolution, we don't have to worry about too much in regards to the density to them. So we just had to make use out of them. But in order to save up some space, I actually cut off the bottom section of the terrain just to make sure that we don't unnecessarily texture that section out, and we're still getting some nice results out of our resolution. So yeah, once I was done with that, I basically started to UV unwrap all the meshes, all the assets within our area, and I just got myself some nice automatic UV unwrapped meshes. I did have some problems actually while using smart UVs, UV unwrap, I think it was with the towels, since the vertices were overlapping. I guess they were not giving me the right type of a texture, but that's going to be fixed when I was working with the substance painter, since it's quite hard to see the density itself as of this moment. So yeah, once I was happy with the overall unwrapping, I was pretty much ready to move on to the texturing part. Alright, now in order to start the texturing process, I just brought everything into my world, and I realized I made a quick mistake in regards to flipping out to normal, since some of the meshes were inverted, and I was actually considering it to keep it within the blender section, within the modeling section. But all of those mistakes, all of those issues that we're fixing right now, that's something you gotta do when you're texturing out an asset, and just dealing with certain bake problems and whatnot, you gotta make sure you get that right as well. So basically, when I baked out a quick ambient occlusion mesh, I realized there was a mistake. There was a slight issue with regards to the towel, so I made sure I UV unwrapped that, and I couldn't UV unwrap it using a smart UV unwrapper, so I actually just made sure I mark certain seams and unwrap them individually, and that seemed to have fixed an issue. But the downside to doing that was that I actually had to UV unwrap the entire material pack, since all of them were packed up together. I had to make sure that everything fits in the right kind of place, and yeah, once I was happy with that, I just made sure that none of the areas are looped up in regards to how they're overlaying the meshes. I don't think there was anything of that regard. I did realize that I left on too much of the vertices in regards to the base of the mesh, so I actually went back and fixed that up real quick. Since they weren't actually quite needed, I just made sure I fixed that up by reducing the amount of topology within Blender, and I went back and started working on the baking of the mesh maps again. And for the monster inside, I actually made sure that I bake out the ambient occlusion on its own as a separate mesh without it being affected by the meshes that are next to him, since he was placed already in a position while I was texturing him. I just had to make sure that it doesn't get affected by any of the external meshes, and that would give us a nicer type of an ambient result for this type of a character. Then, of course, once I was happy with the basic kind of a bake out for the meshes, I think I started off by just using 1024 of a resolution just to make sure that we're getting a nicer type of a look. And once I was happy with everything, I basically went in to start texturing process, and I started off with texturing out the front. I used a smart material wood that I had, which, by the way, if you're interested in it, you can learn how to create it from scratch within a wagon course that we have on our Udemy, Skillshare, and Gumroad. So make sure to check that out, as it's basically a wood created from scratch within Substance Painter without any of the additional textures, external textures. So it turned out quite nice, and I just needed to make sure I adjust the color in order to fit the scene, and all in all it turned out really nice. Then as for the rocks, I actually used a brick texture that I created for a tower scene, which you're also able to find it on YouTube. It just has a couple of nice grunge overlays, and actually while working with this overall asset with everything, I realized that the character itself had been placed within the water plane mesh, and sometimes it works quite alright since the ambient occlusion gets baked out for the water plane, and that gives us additional depth for the water itself. But I didn't quite like the way the legs for the character are being crossed out in regards to that water, so I actually went back into the Blender real quick and hit that water plane and re-imported everything within the mesh through project configurations, and that just made sure that we're hiding the entire water plane. Then afterwards, all I had to do was basically texture out the ground itself. I was playing around with how I'm going to set it all up in regards to the dirt, and if I want to make it look more like sand, for example, and whatnot. But I ended up just getting some pebble brushes and just painting out the pattern myself and just kind of overlaying with the ground dirt that I had. Then I figured that I might want to have some grass, but I realized that it didn't quite look as right, so I actually just got myself some pebbles as well. And even so, I think I ended up changing that as well later on. So playing around with textures, just getting the right type of a feel, the right type of a result within our areas, usually the way you want to go with it. But while working with pebbles, usually within the paint that the Substance Painter provides, by default, I feel like they're a little bit too much intense in regards to the height information, so I tend to just crank it down all the way to make it look a little bit more flat, and that gives us the better type of a result. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I wanted to texture the smaller props to start off, the ones that are at the front of our area. So I started off by getting a nice type of a wood overlay as well as a metal, which, by the way, the metal was also a smart material, so with a couple of extra masks. But what I will say in regards to smart materials and smart masks is, since they're nicely generated, you might consider them be easy to use, and you can just plonk them on any scene and it will work really well. But usually the way it is that when you place the material, the smart material, on your scene, you usually want to adjust the parameters, the values, especially in regards to how the ambient occlusion maps and curvature maps are generated. So you need to make sure you tweak out certain values first, and then afterwards, once you get the right type of result within your environment, then usually you're able to make use out of it, unless it's positioned, unless you're getting the wrong kind of an ambient. So even if you do get a nice type of a look throughout the entire scene, you certainly need to make sure that all of the masks are being applied. So you gotta check each of the individual props separately, and in order to get the right type of result using smart masking. But yeah, moving on, to get a nicer type of a lantern, I was actually playing around with the overall first material, the basic material, and I just got myself a simple type of a cloth with turned down intensity, and that gave us a smooth type of a look for the lantern, which I quite liked. And then as in regards to the framework for the lantern itself, I was playing around actually with a simple cross stitching type of a pattern. I think it was actually a brick pattern, which gave us a nice result. And in order to make it look real nice, I made use out of the 3D projection. I think I started off by just trying to get a cylindrical projection to the area, but I ended up just getting myself a three-dimensional type of projection from all the sides, and that gave us an interesting type of a pattern, especially for the top section, which made it look super nice in my opinion. So I made sure we use that, and then of course I just applied the rest of the lanterns to be using that same type of a pattern as well. I made use out of a mission channel, applied an emission channel in order to kind of highlight those lanterns, since they're going to be separate light sources. I wanted to make sure we get some thickness out of them, so I just paintbrushed them details right onto the lanterns manually, and that gave us some real nice results. And of course, once I was happy with that, I wanted to continue on moving with the more of a modern light sources that we had. So I made use out of a thickness map this time, actually, in order to paint in the emissive map, and that gave us the right kind of results in my opinion, as it gave some nice variation of emissiveness from that simple type of a prop. Also, we don't have to manually paint in the details, so that saves up some of our time. And then afterwards, I played around with the overlays of towels, how the pattern is going to look like. I wanted to get some fabric look out of them, and I just played with, I think, a cloud type of a texture map, and that gave us some nice results. So once I was happy with that, of course, we had to move on with the texturing process in regards to the overall structure, the area within our scene. And I just got myself a really nice type of a colored tint for the wood. I'm pretty much using the same type of a wood material, which I quite like, and that gives us some real nice type of a framework. But I was then playing around with how the pattern of the foundation for the wood is going to look like, and I have some presets for the wood that I like to use. They're basically set up textures with some height value information and some roughness values, and I think they have some additional overlays that have that allows us to get like extra control, like oil type of a grunge map and roughness values that overlay certain detail just to break off the entire shape. And all in all, it just is a really nice type of texture that I like to use. But basically, I just have to make sure that we're using a nice type of a pattern for the bottom type of a wood, since usually especially when I'm working with Neil, we have some patterns for the wood, some types of planks, which is a really nice way of breaking apart the foundation, the base of our environment. But in this case, since I was the one that was modeling, basically, I had to make sure I break off the wood pattern differently. So I actually got an overlay for the texture and just played around with the reflections, and that way I was able to get a nice type of a way to break off the overall design for where the walkway is. And yeah, moving on, I wanted to continue working with the inside section. I wanted to get a nice type of a wood pattern for the shelves as well, so I didn't want to make it look too rough or anything of the sort. I wanted to make them look somewhat of a clean and simplistic design, so I actually overlaid a material that kind of hides away all the roughness values that we had previously. And this way we're able to kind of get a nicer, a more cleaner look out of our wood patterns. We just had to make sure that the intensity for the pattern of the wood itself is a little bit more intense, otherwise it wouldn't be seen, because I was just using a mask that was also applying a color just to get a nicer type of result. And yeah, it turned out quite alright. I was quite happy with that. Then moving on, in order to get a really nice pattern from the front, from the entrance, I actually made use out of a brick pattern, and I used the projection, actually a cylindrical projection, which gave me a really nice type of a look. But for the top section, the way the bricks were being broken off, I didn't quite like that. So what I ended up doing was I ended up just removing the brick pattern from the top, and that gave me a really nice type of a platform that is able to break apart that section. Then as for the cloth of the curtains, I just made use out of a thin type of a pattern that was repeated a lot of times. That way we're able to get a really fine looking type of a cloth, and I just had to make sure we highlight some of that detail for the crevices, and I just made use out of ambient occlusion, the curvature masks, in order to kind of get those types of looks, and it turned out quite alright. I quite liked the way they were colored. But then afterwards I wanted to play around with the front section. Didn't quite like the pebble look within our environment, so I actually got myself a different type of a brick texture, and then after some certain playing around, I got a really nice result out of them. And to start off texturing process for the characters, which by the way I was really excited about. I don't usually texture out, don't get the chance to texture out characters, so I was really happy for that. I started off by applying the main body type of a texture with a bit of an ambient occlusion mask, just to make sure we kind of highlight the roundedness of this character, of this chubby looking character. And in order to get a certain emotion from this character, I made use out of eyes in a stylized, expressive way, and that gave us a real nice type of a look. I actually just used a simple sphere brush and just applied it, and then erased the section underneath, and that gave us a nice curvature for those eyes. So moving on, when I was happy with that, I got some bone material for the horns as well and applied that as well. And then when I was happy with the overall design of the first character, I moved on to the second character. And of course, since it is part of the same environment, we had to make sure it looks quite nice. But the thing is that it looks quite mean type of a monster, quite an evil looking one, so I had to add a bit of an extra type of noise, a bit of a grunginess to it, a little bit more of that. So to start it off, I added a bit of a fur, default type of a fur, onto its body. Then to continue on, in regards to the mask, I increased the roughness values for it, just to make sure we highlight that kind of a damage on his face that we have. And then to highlight the edges, the sharpness of the edges, I used the curvature mask to kind of get that stylized look out of it. And then moving on, in regards to its fur, in order to highlight it, I just made use out of masking in order to paint in certain detail, and that turned out quite alright. It just allowed us to highlight some of that fur on the top shoulders that are in a bit more chunky kind of a way, and I think that gives the overall stylized look to the character in a nice kind of a way. But of course, it didn't have as much of a height information as a light, so I had to make sure I highlight some of those edges a little bit more using the curvature masks, since otherwise it would look too plain because we were applying so much noise on its fur. It didn't stand out quite as much, so I just had to make sure it stands out a little bit more and it makes it look quite nice. And once I was happy with that, we basically had to make sure we get ourselves a weapon that's fitting for the character. We get that wooden club to look like it's been quite worn out, but it's still stylized. And then when I was happy with the style, I of course had to ruin it by adding some gore to it, and I don't know why I did it. I could have kept this entire scene, to be honest, like a simple and calm type looking scene, but I did end up just kind of going to that direction again, and just had to make sure I had a bunch of gore to it and some blood. And then yeah, in order to make the floor looking like it's being scraped off, I made sure I brush in some of that detail as well, and that just makes it look like it's been tainted by this monster walking towards this little guy. And yeah, all in all, it turned out quite alright. I'm not sure if I needed to add so much of a gory type of a look, but this turned out quite nice as in regards to the texturing part. And of course, when we were done with it all, we had to export all of our texture maps out. So 4K is the way that we went with, of course, to get more pixel density and to get better resolution out of it, but that takes a longer time because by default you are actually texturing in 2K, so all of those textures has to be converted into 4K resolution, and then afterwards they can be exported out, which is done automatically, but it just takes a while to do so. But yeah, once we were done with the texturing process, we were now ready to go on to setting the environment up within the Unreal Engine 5. As for the Unreal Engine 5 part of the video, in order to start off the project, I just created myself a third-person template and created myself a new map so we wouldn't have all of those additional parts from the level that we'd have usually. And then, of course, right away I've imported the FBX file, made sure that we have the combined meshes ticked off, and then once I got the texture maps imported, I just made sure that sRGBs are ticked off from the packed texture maps. Then afterwards, I created myself a quick PBR material that I'll be able to use with material instances. The only difference is that I wanted to make sure that the emission map is being able to easily change, so I just made sure I have some parameters for that as well. Then afterwards, I just quickly imported in all of the assets within the scene. Made sure that the location is set to default 00, so to be at exactly the center of the world, and then start replacing all of the materials with the materials instances that we created. And I did so because I figured that it might be easier to just reattach the textures and see live how they would look like when I'm changing the materials. But I think during this process I made a mistake and referenced out a different kind of a texture map or different material. I had to go in and change that real quick. But before doing that though, I went in and started creating myself a nice little platform for our environment to sit on, and that way we'll get some nice shadows, soft shadows going from the side of the environment, and we're able to control the base color of the scene. And when basically I noticed that the materials were different, I just went in and just reassigned them. I made a quick copy out of them and quickly changed them up, and that once I was able to fix that, I went in and continued on with working with the background, and I'm actually making use out of the exponential fog in order to get the nicer results out of our scene and get a nice transition from the colors. So I was quite happy with that. Then afterwards, in regards to the water, I was actually thinking about what to do with it. And for this project, I actually got myself the water material from a course that we just have created. So if you're interested in that, you might want to go ahead and check that out. This one is just a default material without any of the additional VFX or any of the particles. So I'd get a nice type of a foundation within this animated scene, just a nice kind of a layer of flowing water. And with a couple of tweaks, you're able to get some really nice results. So yeah, I was really glad I'm able to use that. And once I was happy with the base, the color for the water, I went in and started playing around with the color palette, with the way our design is going to look like in the background. And when I was starting to change the darker kind of colors to get a more kind of an evening type of an atmosphere, so we'd be able to get more visible of lights coming from the light sources from lanterns and whatnot, I realized that we don't actually have any of the light sources to begin with. So I went in and started playing around with that. Since we already have some emission, all we gotta do is just match the type of color with the source of light, and we get some pretty nice results. And after I was happy with that, I went in and then started playing around with the particles. I wanted to get some nice particles, some fog coming out from the hot water, some steam that is. So I got myself a real nice texture and I just started applying it onto the water. I made sure it just kind of slowly raises up. And in order to soften up the entire texture, I actually just made sure that I use a lot of the spawn particles that have a low transparency. And since the texture itself is an additive material, that way we're able to like overlay all of those textures nicely without much of a performance heavy task. In order to make it more organic, I also added some rotation within the fog, within the mist itself, and that just made it look extra nice for the spraying the top of the water. And then afterwards I played around a little bit extra with the lights. I made sure that The indirect lighting is set a little bit extra within one of the lights behind the monster, so it would light up with some ambient lighting a little bit more in the back, and that way it would highlight the entire silhouette of a monster a little bit more when we're looking through the curtain. And of course, once we were done with that, I pretty much was finished with the entire project. So all we had to do was set up all of the cameras in a nice kind of way. We had to consider the way we want to present this work, and basically to start off, I wanted to set up a nice close-up shot for the front section of the environment. I also made a nice quick panning shot that goes in towards the doorstep and just kind of zooms in towards the camera, towards the monster itself, and that turned out quite alright. I didn't quite like the way the emissiveness of the eyes were set up. I had some extra additional emissiveness of red type of eyeballs glowing from the monster. So what I ended up doing was actually making a material with some parameters that will allow me to animate the intensity of the emissiveness throughout the material itself, throughout the level sequencer. So when we get closer, we'd be able to kind of have that kind of a red sparkly effect within the monster, and I think it turned out quite alright in regards to that. So I quite like that shot as well. Then of course, in order to present the overall work, we gotta get ourselves a nice turntable for within the scene, just to make sure we're having a nice overall kind of a composition throughout the entire environment. We're showcasing our entire work, and that turned out quite alright. Then I want to kind of highlight the overall aerial shot from the inside. Since we don't have a roof, we don't have the side of a wall, we kind of have to make use out of that in order to show our work and what's inside of that section. And then of course, to finish it off, we also added a quick video, a 5-second video of a transitional shot, so we'd be able to put it within our YouTube to break up the parts in between the video. So yeah, all in all, we just had to play around with the cameras, with the focal points. And the way I create the focal points, by the way, is just I create certain objects. I create any shape, basically any primitive shape will work. Then afterwards, I just make sure that the in-game is set to invisible, and I'm attaching a camera directly towards this, so the camera would always be directly positioned towards it, and whenever you move that object, it will be following alongside it. Now that we're finished with it all, let's go ahead and review the entire process. The modeling part took a whole 8 hours and 42 minutes to create, an entire day basically. When I saw the time, I was quite surprised myself, as usually the time it takes for such a project would take less time. The two main factors as to why it took so long to create the project was, firstly, because it was the first time creating an environment with characters for the 3D shooter video, so we had to think out their position within the world and their poses. The second, which was probably the main reason, was probably me being out of practice. As hard as it is to admit, since I haven't done a lot of modeling in Blender and I was more focused on setting up the environments and texturing them using the Substance Painter and Unreal Engine, I'm nowhere near as fast and efficient as the colleague Neil, who has been constantly doing 3D modeling in Blender for as long as I remember. So with that in mind, if you're working on improving your 3D modeling skills, just remember to keep consistent with it. Anyways, when modeling this scene, what I found challenging was getting the right layout for the scene, since I wanted to make an environment visible from the outdoors and the indoors as well. And of course the characters. I sculpted them out using ZBrush, made sure to pose them within the software as well, which gave me some nice controls over the character, but all in all, keeping good proportions, even for a stylized scene, was a rather hard thing to do. So overall, I'm giving this one a 6 out of 10 in regards to difficulty for modeling. The texturing part took 2 hours and 53 minutes total to paint in all the detail within the environment. It was a rather straightforward process. As usual, I made use out of the smart materials to texture out most of the pieces, which took some time to set it all up, as some of the objects were surrounded by other pieces within the indoor section, whilst other assets were on an open area, meaning that the generated ambient occlusion was all over the place and we had to manually adjust the generated mask coming from them. As in regards to the monsters, it was quite a nice and simple process to get them painted, as I wanted to keep them rather simplistic within a stylized state, which meant that I didn't have to overdo the texturing part for them, just had to make sure I had the combination of curvature and ambient occlusion masks to highlight certain shape, especially for the furry friend in the back. Since I was using such a noisy fur for him the whole time, I had to make sure to bring out the clusters of fur from the hide detail for his shoulders to stand out a little bit more within the scene. Otherwise the detail for them would easily get lost. So yeah, I'm giving this one a 5 out of 10 as it feels as average as it gets in terms of difficulty, even with all the characters within. The scene setup took 1 hour and 20 minutes to do. It was a super fast and easy process. So after bringing all the meshes and assigning the material, most of the work was pretty much done. And to give it an extra visual look for the hot spring, of course we had to add some mist coming out of the water, which with basic particle knowledge is a rather simple task. The thing that I would point out though is that getting a nice texture for the fog is quite important for getting the right results within the VFX of the water, especially since this is a type of a stylized scene that will have some water for the frontal section of our composing shot. Other than that, working on the background transitional color is quite important as well. We need to make sure that the color palette works really well in regards to bringing out the environment visually as a 3D artwork. Oh, and let's not forget the shining eyes that we did for the creature, which although is a small detail, it helps to give that much of a menacing look to the character. So all in all, I'm thinking about giving this one a 3 out of 10 in regards to the difficulty. I think the environment was pretty much set in regards to its presentation. We just had to make sure that some of those camera shots give us a real nice visual type of story from this artwork. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video for a Blender to Unreal Engine 5 Monster Hot Spring video. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like to see us do next. We have just recently created a new course for creating an environment within Unreal Engine 5, and I'm really excited about it. It will teach you things like how to make the best use out of the Quixel library and how to edit them to your liking, how to create water system from scratch using material and particle systems, and more will be found within it. And if you want to see even more of our work, you can also check out the links down below to see a massive library of courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up to our Patreon. We also have some free goods on our Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download, which, speaking of, there'll be soon more to come. And that'll be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.